Sir,
The
I
airport
need
was
you to
already
step
tense
back.
that morning.
I'm not going anywhere.
Rolling
This
suitcases
is your
echoed
last
across the
warning,
polished
or
floor.
what?
Flight announcements cut through the air, and long security lines stretched farther than usual. People were impatient, tired. Everyone just wanted to get through and move on. That was when he stepped forward. He didn't look important, no entourage, no designer suit, no signs of urgency. Just a quiet, middle-aged man dressed simply, standing calmly as the line moved ahead. He kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. To most people, he looked like someone you'd never notice twice. But the security guard noticed him immediately. The guard's eyes narrowed as the man placed his bag on the conveyor belt. Instead of the routine nod most passengers received, the guard stopped the belt abruptly. The sudden clunk drew attention. Nearby travelers turned their heads. "What's this?" the guard said loudly, holding up the bag as if it were suspicious. The man answered politely, short, respectful, calm. That calm seemed to irritate the guard even more. The guard leaned closer, raising his voice so others could hear. He questioned the man's documents, then questioned why he was even in this terminal. A few chuckles rippled through the line as the guard smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "You people always think rules don't apply to you," the guard said, loud enough for strangers to listen. The words hung in the air. A couple nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone behind the line sighed. A woman clutched her passport tighter. This was no longer routine security. It had turned into a public display. Still, the man said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood there, eyes steady, breathing slow, as if he had all the time in the world. That silence confused people. Most passengers protested when delayed. Some begged. Others snapped back. But this man did none of that. His calm wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It felt deliberate. The guard mistook that silence for submission. He laughed under his breath and waved another officer closer, gesturing toward the man as if he were a problem that needed handling. More eyes turned toward the scene. Funds stayed in pockets, but curiosity filled the space. What no one realized in that moment was this. This wasn't just a random delay. This wasn't just an arrogant guard on a power trip. This was the beginning of a situation that would flip the entire terminal on its head. And within minutes, the same voice mocking this quiet man would struggle to speak at all. This terminal wasn't like the others. It wasn't the loud, crowded side of the airport, where families rushed barefoot through security and backpacks, spilled open. This was the premium terminal, cleaner floors, softer lighting, quieter voices. The kind of place where people walked slower, because they believed time worked differently for them. Here, status mattered. You could feel it in the way people dressed. Tailored jackets, polished shoes, watches that caught the light when someone adjusted their sleeve. Conversations weren't about vacations or reunions, they were about deals, schedules, and destinations that sounded important, simply because of how casually they were mentioned. This terminal was built for people who were used to being prioritized. Security here operated differently too. The rules were the same on paper, but the attitude wasn't. Guards weren't just checking bags, they were guarding an image. They saw themselves as gatekeepers of privilege, deciding who belonged and who didn't. Confidence was rewarded. Humility was often misunderstood. Silence was seen as weakness. Every day the guards watched people try to prove themselves. Some flashed expensive passes too quickly. Others dropped names under their breath. A few even argued, convinced their status placed them above procedure. Those were the moments guards enjoyed the most, reminding powerful-looking people that here, the uniform was in charge. But occasionally, someone came through who didn't play the game at all. No name-dropping, no attitude, no performance. Those were the ones that confused the system. The quiet man standing at the checkpoint didn't match the environment. Not because he looked out of place, but because he didn't seem affected by it. While others shifted impatiently, checked their watches, or sighed loudly, he waited, still, unbothered. That alone made him stand out. In a place where everyone tried to signal importance, his lack of signaling felt almost disrespectful to the culture itself. Behind the scenes, the airport ran on hierarchy. Junior guards followed orders. Senior staff watched from a distance. Everyone knew that mistakes here weren't small. A wrong decision could delay flights, embarrass VIPs, or trigger formal complaints that climbed quickly. That pressure created ego. Some guards coped by staying professional. Others coped by becoming rigid. And a few coped by asserting control wherever they could, especially over people who looked like they wouldn't fight back. The guard dealing with the quiet man had already had a long shift. 2 arguments earlier, one supervisor warning about being too soft. And now, standing in front of him, was someone who didn't react the way people usually did. No visible stress, no fear, no rush. To the guard, that calm didn't look confident, it looked suspicious. Around them, the terminal continued its rhythm. Boarding calls echoed softly. Shoes clicked against marble. A couple in first class whispered about a delayed connection. A businessman typed furiously on his phone, barely glancing up. Yet something about the scene pulled attention. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. A few people began watching out of the corner of their eyes. Not because of what was happening, but because of what wasn't. There was no shouting, no argument. Just tension, quietly tightening. The guard straightened his posture, aware of the small audience forming. In places like this, authority wasn't just enforced, it was performed, and he was determined not to lose control of the moment. He spoke again, louder than necessary. The man listened, nodded once, and remained exactly where he was. That composure didn't fit the setting. In a terminal built on hierarchy and appearance, this man's indifference to status felt almost disruptive. As if he wasn't impressed. As if he didn't care whether he was delayed, judged, or embarrassed. And that unsettled more than one person nearby. Some sensed something was off but couldn't explain why. Others felt a flicker of secondhand embarrassment, like watching someone poke at a sleeping animal, unsure if it would move. What no one realized yet was that this environment, the polished floors, the egos, the rigid roles, was about to magnify a mistake. Because places built on appearances are the most vulnerable to quiet truths. And the longer this moment stretched, the clearer it became that this situation was not unfolding the way the guard expected. Have you ever seen authority misjudge the wrong person? The security guard took a half step forward. It wasn't necessary. The man hadn't moved. He hadn't reached for anything. He hadn't even shifted his weight. But the guard closed the distance anyway, planting himself closer than protocol required, close enough to make the message clear. This wasn't about safety anymore. It was about dominance. The guard's uniform was crisp, his badge polished, his posture stiff with authority. He'd learned quickly that in places like this, tone mattered more than rules. And right now, his tone was sharp, cutting, designed to be heard. "You're holding up the line," he said loudly, glancing behind the man as if to rally support. "People have places to be." A few passengers nodded automatically, not because they agreed, but because they didn't want trouble. The man answered calmly. He apologized for the delay. His voice was steady, respectful, almost quiet. That only made things worse. The guard scoffed and let out a short laugh, the kind meant to signal superiority. "That bag," he said, tapping it with his boot, "looks heavier than it should be. What's inside?" The man explained, briefly, clearly. The guard tilted his head, unconvinced. "Aha. And where are you headed exactly?" The question wasn't suspicious, it was intrusive, and everyone nearby knew it. When the man answered, the guard raised his eyebrows theatrically. "First class," he repeated, louder this time. "Really?" A ripple of attention moved through the line. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. A woman looked down at her phone, pretending not to watch. The guard smirked. "I'll need to see that boarding pass again," he said, holding out his hand. The man handed it over without hesitation. The guard studied it longer than necessary, flipping it once, then again, as if hoping to find a flaw that wasn't there. When he didn't, his jaw tightened. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound patronizing, "this terminal is usually for people who travel a lot." The implication was clear. People like you don't belong here. A few people in line exchanged glances. This was no longer subtle. The guard was testing how far he could go. Still, the man didn't react. No defensiveness. No irritation. No attempt to prove himself. That silence irritated the guard more than any argument could have. "What's your job?" the guard asked suddenly. The question landed hard. It wasn't relevant. It wasn't professional. And it wasn't quiet. The man paused for half a second, just long enough to acknowledge the insult, then answered politely. The guard laughed again, this time louder. "Figures," he said, shaking his head. "I see this all the time. People dressing one way, pretending to be something else." A few chuckles surfaced from somewhere in the crowd. Not many. Nervous ones. Encouraged, the guard leaned into it. "You can't just walk into places like this and expect special treatment," he said, his voice rising. "Rules exist for a reason." The man met his eyes, calm, unblinking. That look, steady, measured, felt different. Not defiant, not afraid, just observant. The guard misread it completely. He turned slightly toward the line, addressing everyone now. "This is exactly why we have delays," he announced. "Because some people think they're entitled." The word entitled echoed. A man near the back frowned. A woman shifted her bag from one shoulder to the other. Someone whispered, "That's unnecessary." But no one intervened. Power trips thrive on silence. The guard waved another officer over, pointing at the man like evidence. "Secondary screening," he said. "Full check." The officer hesitated for a split second. Just a flicker. Then nodded. The guard turned back to the man, satisfaction creeping into his expression. "Step aside," he ordered. The command was firm. Public, humiliating. The man didn't argue. He didn't sigh. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't ask to speak to a supervisor. He picked up his bag slowly and stepped exactly where he was told. That calm, unchanged, unshaken, felt almost unsettling now, as if the man knew something the guard didn't. But the guard was too invested to notice. In his mind, he'd already won. He'd established control. He'd proven a point to the crowd, to his colleagues, maybe even to himself. What he didn't realize was that every word he'd spoken had been heard. Every gesture had been noticed. And every second of this performance was being quietly remembered. Because sometimes, the loudest person in the room is the least aware of what's coming next. The moment stretched. What should have taken seconds now felt unusually slow, as if time itself had decided to pause and watch. The man stood where he'd been directed, his bag resting beside his foot, his hands relaxed at his sides. There was no tension in his shoulders, no tightness in his jaw, nothing that suggested panic, irritation, or fear. Just stillness. Around him the airport continued moving, but differently now. People walked past with quieter steps. Conversations lowered in volume. A few passengers pretended to scroll through their phones, yet their eyes kept drifting back to the scene. The man noticed everything, not in an obvious way. He didn't scan the room or shift his stance. He simply registered things. The guard's breathing, the hesitation of the second officer, the subtle change in posture from people who sensed something wasn't right. He had seen this before, not this exact place, not this uniform, but this dynamic, authority trying to provoke a reaction, ego waiting to be fed, power measured by volume, and he refused to give it what it wanted. When the guard spoke again, it was sharper. Impatient. "Stand right there," he said, as if the man had shown any sign of moving. "Don't touch anything." The man nodded once. That was all. No sarcasm, no visible annoyance, no explanation offered. That nod wasn't submission, it was control. And the difference mattered. The guard began opening the bag, exaggerating each movement. Zippers pulled harder than necessary. Items lifted and inspected longer than required. It was a performance meant to assert dominance, to show the small crowd that he was in charge. The man watched quietly, not the bag, not the guard's hands, the guard's face. He listened without interrupting. When asked a question, he answered briefly, clearly. No extra words, no emotional tone, just facts. That composure unsettled the second officer. He shifted his weight, glanced toward the supervisor's desk, then back at the man. Something about this situation felt off, not dangerous but wrong, like pushing a door that wasn't meant to be opened. The guard, however, mistook the quiet for weakness. "You're very calm," he said mockingly. "Most people get nervous when they're checked like this." The man met his eyes, calmly, respectfully. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The question was simple, neutral, not defensive, but it landed heavier than expected. For a brief moment the guard hesitated. The room felt smaller, the air tighter, as if the question had flipped the spotlight without raising its brightness. "No," the guard replied quickly, masking the pause. "Just doing my job." The man nodded again. Silence returned. That silence was different now. It wasn't empty, it was weighted, observant, almost instructional. The kind of silence that makes people aware of their own behavior. A woman nearby shifted uncomfortably. A man a few steps away frowned. Someone behind whispered, "Why is he being like that?" The guard cleared his throat and continued the search, but the confidence in his movements had dulled slightly. He spoke less, louder when he did, but less certain. The man remained unchanged. No sighs, no glances at the clock, no attempt to rush the process. It was as if delays meant nothing to him. That, more than anything, made people uneasy. In places like this, time was currency. Everyone guarded it. Everyone fought for it. And here was someone who seemed completely unaffected by losing it. The second officer leaned closer and whispered something to the guard. The words were too quiet to hear. It wasn't supportive. It wasn't mocking. It was cautious. The guard waved him off. "I've got this," he said aloud. The man heard it. He said nothing. Instead, he adjusted his stance slightly, not away, not toward, but balanced. Grounded. Like someone who had learned long ago that control doesn't come from force, but from presence. The guard finished checking the bag and zipped it shut. He didn't hand it back immediately. He held it for an extra second, then another, waiting for a reaction. It never came. That was the moment something shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally for the people watching, for the second officer, and even for the guard himself. The power dynamic he thought he'd established wasn't holding. The usual responses weren't appearing. No pleading, no anger, no embarrassment, just quiet certainty. The man stood there unbothered, as if he knew that this moment, this pause, was not his to worry about. Because sometimes, the strongest position isn't pushing back, it's knowing exactly when to wait. By now, the attention was impossible to ignore. What had started as a minor delay had quietly transformed into a moment people couldn't look away from. Travelers slowed their steps as they passed. Some stopped outright, pretending to adjust their bags or check their phones, but staying just close enough to watch. The silence around the checkpoint felt heavier than noise. Whispers began to travel, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that subtle way tension spreads when people sense something unfolding. Why is he being treated like that? Someone murmured. That seems unnecessary, another voice replied. A woman near the glass barrier glanced between the guard and the calm man, her eyebrows drawn together. She looked uncomfortable, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how, or if she should. The guard noticed the attention. His posture stiffened again. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and spoke a little louder, reasserting his presence. Authority, after all, depended on appearance, and he was beginning to feel it slipping. Sir, you're going to need to wait right here, he said again, repeating himself even though the man hadn't moved an inch. The man acknowledged him with a slight nod. Nothing more. That quiet response was starting to unsettle people, not because it was defiant, but because it didn't fit the script. Everyone expected escalation. Voices raised, arguments sparked. But instead, the scene stayed suspended in this uncomfortable calm. A nearby flight attendant paused mid-step. She looked at the man carefully, then at the guard, then back again. Something about the man's posture caught her attention, not arrogance, not fear, but familiarity, like someone who had spent years navigating tense situations without needing to announce it. She didn't say anything. But she didn't walk away either. Behind the checkpoint, another security staff member glanced over from a distance. He frowned slightly, sensing something was off. The delay was stretching longer than it should have. And delays, especially in this terminal, raised questions. The second officer shifted again, clearly uneasy now. He leaned closer to the guard and spoke in a low voice. Maybe we should. The guard cut him off with a sharp look.
Not yet.
The words were quiet, but firm. The man heard the exchange. He remained still. Time dragged on deliberately. Seconds felt longer than they were. The line behind the checkpoint had slowed to a crawl, but no one complained, not openly. People were watching too closely to break the moment. A businessman checked his watch, then stopped himself from saying anything. A couple whispered to each other, eyes flicking back toward the scene. Someone behind muttered, "This is getting weird." And it was. Not chaotic, not loud, just wrong. The guard cleared his throat and glanced around, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on him. He shifted his weight, tapping his foot lightly. Confidence had given way to irritation, and irritation was quickly becoming discomfort. He reached for his radio. For a brief second, it looked like he was about to call someone. The man noticed. So did the second officer. The guard hesitated, his thumb hovering over the button. Then he lowered the radio slowly, as if reconsidering. That small pause didn't go unnoticed. A woman a few steps away raised her eyebrows. The flight attendant's expression tightened. The second officer exhaled quietly, almost in relief. Something about that near call suggested the guard wasn't as certain anymore. The man adjusted his stance slightly, still balanced, still calm. He didn't rush the moment. He didn't fill the silence. He let it do its work. The atmosphere had shifted from judgment to curiosity. Who was this man? Why wasn't he reacting? Why did this feel like the wrong person to push? Even the guard seemed to feel it now. He spoke again, but the edge in his voice was dulled. "We're just following procedure," he said, as much to the crowd as to himself. No one responded. The quiet pressed back harder than any argument could have. The second officer glanced once more toward the supervisor's area, then back at the man. His expression wasn't hostile, it was cautious, respectful even. The guard noticed that too, and for the first time since this began, doubt flickered across his face. Not fear, not guilt, just uncertainty. The man remained where he was, composed and unshaken, as if he knew this moment, this uncomfortable stretch of time, was doing more than words ever could. Because sometimes tension doesn't need to explode. Sometimes it just needs witnesses. If this moment made you uncomfortable or curious, share this story, like the video, and comment which part stood out to you so far. The shift happened quietly. No announcement, no raised voices, just a subtle change in the air that people felt before they understood it. Footsteps approached from behind the checkpoint, measured, confident, unhurried. Not the pace of someone rushing to solve a problem, but of someone who already knew what they were walking into. The second officer noticed first. His posture straightened. His head turned slightly. Relief flickered across his face, followed by something closer to concern. He stepped back half a pace, creating space without being told. The guard didn't notice right away. He was still focused on maintaining control, still locked into the role he'd been playing since the beginning. He adjusted his belt, cleared his throat, and prepared to speak again. But the voice that cut through the tension wasn't his. Is there a problem here? It wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, but it carried authority. The guard turned. Standing just beyond the checkpoint was a senior airport official, well-dressed, composed, and clearly used to being obeyed. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were alert, taking in the scene in seconds. The line, the delay, the crowd, the man standing calmly to the side. The official's gaze settled on the man, and something changed. His steps slowed, his shoulders relaxed, his expression shifted not to fear, but to recognition. He moved closer, passing the guard without acknowledging him at first. The guard opened his mouth to explain, already forming excuses, but the official raised a hand gently. Just a moment, he said. The terminal felt suddenly silent. People leaned in without moving. Phones stayed down, but attention sharpened. Even the ambient noise of the airport seemed to dull, as if the space itself was listening. The official stopped in front of the calm man. There was no suspicion in his eyes, no judgment, only respect, he said carefully. The man met his gaze and nodded once. That nod was enough. The official swallowed, then spoke again. This time more quietly, more deliberately. Steven Seagal. The name landed like a dropped glass. For a split second, no one reacted. Then everything changed. The guard froze, not metaphorically, physically. His shoulders locked. His face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The second officer looked down, exhaling slowly, as if a weight he hadn't named had finally lifted. Nearby passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. A few gasps slipped out before people caught themselves. Whispers ignited instantly, racing through the crowd faster than the tension had earlier. Did he just say, "That can't be"? No way. The man, Steven, didn't react to the murmurs. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't step forward or assert himself. He simply stood there, the same calm presence he'd been from the start. The official straightened, his tone now unmistakably respectful. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "This shouldn't have happened." The guard finally found his voice.
I didn't know."
He stammered. He didn't say anything. He didn't. Steven raised a hand gently, not to silence him, not to scold him, just to pause the moment. "It's fine," he said calmly. Two simple words. They carried more weight than shouting ever could. The official turned to the guard slowly. His expression wasn't angry, but it was serious. Disappointed. The kind of look that didn't need explanation. "We'll discuss this later," he said quietly. The guard nodded quickly, eyes fixed on the floor now. The confidence he'd displayed earlier had vanished completely, replaced by the realization of what he'd done and who he'd done it to. Steven picked up his bag calmly, no rush, no triumph, no satisfaction, just composure. As the official gestured for him to proceed, Steven paused, not for himself, but for the moment. He glanced briefly at the guard, not with anger, but with something closer to understanding. The crowd watched, stunned. They hadn't witnessed an explosion. They hadn't seen revenge. They hadn't heard shouting. They had seen power revealed quietly. As Steven walked forward, the line parted instinctively. People stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. And behind him, the guard remained still, staring at the floor, realizing too late that the man he'd tried to diminish had never needed to prove anything at all. Because the most shocking part of the reveal wasn't who Steven Seagal was. It was how little he needed anyone else to know. The terminal slowly returned to motion. Footsteps resumed their normal rhythm. Conversations picked back up, though softer than before. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered in the air, heavy and reflective, like the silence after a powerful speech. Stephen moved forward calmly, following the official's guidance, but he didn't rush. There was no urgency in his steps, no need to escape the scene or enjoy the attention. He walked the same way he had stood, grounded, composed, unchanged by what had just been revealed. Behind him, the guard remained still. His earlier confidence was gone. Not shattered in a dramatic way, but drained. The kind of realization that doesn't explode outward, but sinks inward, forcing reflection whether it's wanted or not. The official didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He didn't make a scene. That was intentional. Consequences, when handled properly, don't need an audience. As Stephen paused briefly near the end of the checkpoint, the official spoke again, quietly, respectfully. "We'll make sure this is addressed appropriately," he said. "Thank you for your patience." Stephen nodded. "That's all I ask," he replied. No threats, no demands, no reminders of who he was. Just dignity. A few nearby passengers watched with something close to admiration, not because of fame, but because of restraint. In a moment where most people would have lashed out, he had chosen something far rarer. Control. The guard finally looked up. His eyes met Stephen's for a brief second. There was no anger in Stephen's gaze, no satisfaction, no judgment, only a quiet awareness. That look said more than words ever could. It said this didn't have to happen. It said you chose how this went. It said learn from it. Stephen turned and continued on. Behind him, the official gestured subtly to another supervisor, and the two stepped aside with the guard. Their conversation was low, serious, and private. No pointing, no accusations, just accountability. That mattered, because justice isn't about humiliation, it's about correction. Around them, people processed what they'd witnessed. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged quiet comments about how differently the situation could have ended. One man whispered. He never even raised his voice. A woman nodded. That's real power. And that was the lesson, whether anyone meant to teach it or not. Power isn't in uniforms. It isn't in volume. It isn't in making others feel small. Real power is knowing you don't need to prove anything. The guard would carry this moment with him long after the shift ended. Not because he'd been exposed, but because he'd been shown something uncomfortable. That authority without respect is fragile. That assumptions are dangerous. And that silence, when used wisely, can be stronger than force. Stephen reached his gate without fanfare. No crowd followed him. No one asked for photos. No applause broke out. And somehow that made the moment even more powerful, because the point was never recognition. It was respect, earned through restraint. As boarding began, life moved on, flights departed. Announcements echoed. The airport returned to being what it always was, a place of passing moments. But for those who witnessed what happened, something stayed behind. A reminder. That how you treat someone when you think they're nobody says everything about who you are. And that sometimes, the most shocking response isn't anger or revenge, but calm, unwavering dignity. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Different cities, different countries, one shared lesson. More powerful stories are coming, and your feedback helps shape what we tell next.